So I
All
can't
right.
do it.
I see a button here, record. I might. Oh, it
Oh,
looks like
thank
someone
you,
else.
Michael. Thank you. All right, sweet. All right, so then I'm going to start the substantive part of this now, where we can talk about what the zoning atlas is and why it's important. So I don't know, have people here had any experience? Have you seen a zoning atlas or interacted with one before? Feel free to just talk out loud.
Yeah,
Yes,
I was
no?
at the housing conference and got the intro from the founder of that. I'm totally blanking on her name.
Sarah Bronin. Yes, yeah. So for those who don't know, who maybe have never interacted with the zoning atlas before, basically this is an interactive web-based tool that's going to visualize the distributions of zoning code sort of attributes statewide. So every city, town, village, and even some kind of like unoccupied areas, they all have these zoning rules that tell you what you're allowed to do with the land that you live on or that you own. They tell you what you can and can't build, what kinds of businesses you can run or can't run, and they tell you things about the kinds of buildings that you might build that are requirements for you. So they might tell you what the maximum height size is for a type of housing. They might tell you what kind of building materials you can or can't use. They might tell you what it's supposed to look like. They might tell you how many families can occupy a particular building. And looking at that information spatially is so much more effective than trying to figure it out on your own. So right now, if I wanted to know every town in Vermont, for example, that allowed for family housing to be constructed without any public hearing, just you decide you're going to do it, I would have to read thousands and thousands of pages of code for each of those towns so that I could figure out where am I allowed to do that. And what we would like to do with the zoning atlas is really democratize that process so that anybody could know really quickly where they're allowed to build one particular type of housing or where it's prohibited, so you can make better decisions. First of all, as a private property owner, you know whether or not you're allowed to build a mother-in-law apartment and move your mom in. But also policymakers and planners can make better decisions about where they're going to allocate resources, because they might say, well, we'd like to move this transit system over to this part of the state. But if you look at that part of the state, maybe you aren't able to build the kind of housing that typically would be filled with people who would use that type of transit. So this sort of zoning atlas that you can see here on the screen, basically this is a visualization of what you're allowed to do. On the left, we've got New Hampshire. You can tell the difference between places where a small lot two-family home is allowed by right, where it's prohibited, and where land is not even developable. So if you know where it's allowed, you have a sense of like what percent of New Hampshire allows that particular type of housing. And then you can say, well, is that part of, is that also developable? So you can have information not only about whether it's allowed, but whether, even if it is allowed, whether it's practical. And so that's the sort of analysis that you can do using a zoning atlas. And if you see on the right, Connecticut, they did a visualization of where you can have single family housing by right, and that's the top graphic, and where you can have 4 or more family housing by right, that's the lower graphic. So obviously you can build single family housing much easier. You can certainly, it's certainly prohibited less often than 4 or more family housing, and that has an impact on who can live where, with what access to which services, whether it's transportation, water, sewer, or others. So I would say that Vermont already has something similar to this called the Planning Atlas, which encodes some information visually that planners use, but it doesn't have zoning information. And so zoning information has a really significant impact. Historically, it has been used across the country, basically to identify what land use is appropriate or allowable in certain areas. And it's had quite a negative history in terms of facilitating community segregation and restricting access to very important resources for people who are lower income. So one of the things we'd like for the zoning atlas to do is make it easier to build affordable housing that meets a community's needs and assist with things like community desegregation or transportation access. So let's see if I can figure out how to use my own computer. There we go. And you might wonder who uses a zoning atlas. And like I said, it could be a lot of different audiences that use it. Could be municipal planners, could be state agencies, but it could also be everyday people like you or me. Students and researchers could go on there and say, I want to know, what is the impact of zoning on placing homeless households in higher opportunity neighborhoods? That's a research question that I have. And so one of the things I could do is layer a geospatial mapping of where people are able to access tenant-based rental assistance, like where those homes are, and then where those homes are allowed to be built, and say, okay, is it the case that a person is more likely to be able to be placed in a higher opportunity neighborhood because that housing is more likely to be available there or is allowed to be built there? Or is it some other factor that's causing us to have difficulty, what's the word I'm looking for, affirmatively furthering fair housing? And then we also just have people who are interested because they're curious. They may say, I really want to increase my income in my household. I have, I can't work for a living, or maybe I can only work part-time, but I'd like to be able to rent out part of my home. Can I build an accessory dwelling unit that's basically like a mother-in-law apartment, or maybe a small sort of garage unit on your property? Can I rent that out and get income that way to support my family? And that kind of information can also be visualized, so an individual landowner can know whether or not they're able to do that. And so the Zoning Atlas is a methodology that was developed by this national group. Actually, Cornell really started it and they worked with Connecticut to develop a Zoning Atlas methodology that will enable the sort of apples to apples comparison between jurisdictions. So in Vermont, you can know what the rules are in Burlington versus what they are in Bennington, and you can sort of do that analysis, but you will also theoretically be able to do it nationwide, because if we all use the same definitions, we all use the same data, then we would be able to do those kinds of comparisons, whereas right now we can't, because the language of zoning is so dense and so technical, and it varies so much from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So some of our work is going to be looking at those regulations, breaking them down into like their very elemental components and saying, does this meet the definition under the National Zoning Atlas methodology of allowed by right housing in this particular district? And then we would code that, and it would show the same way there as it would in another district that maybe sort of verbalized it differently under their codes. This should open up a lot of research opportunities, and we should be able to join that data with other national data sets like the American Housing Survey or the American Community Survey to get a sense of zoning's relationship to other external things too, like income, like affordability, like I think Michael's interest is in the per unit cost of housing in particular areas. This can help us to strengthen our city plans and our regional plans and make sure that people are zoning sort of in a way that makes sense across jurisdictions. So if you've got two adjacent jurisdictions, they may want to have similar zoning regulations, or they may not, but this will be able to let us see what it looks like if you have like two adjacent places that have very different schemes underlying their rules. So the way that the National Zoning Atlas has done this is they say, okay, zoning codes, basically they catalog uses that are allowable, whether it's residential or commercial or some other type of use. There's also a way that they get us sort of the dimensional standards for a lot. So they'll tell you what's the minimum lot size if you want to have a single family home or a 4-family home. They might tell you the maximum density for that district. So maybe you can have 4 units per acre, or maybe you can only have 1 unit per acre. That'll give you a sense of how sort of densely populated a district is. They'll also give you information about how far back you have to set your home on your property, or maybe how far in you have to set it from the sides, the number of minimum parking spaces that are required for every unit of housing. And then there's also information about cataloging the structures that we would be able to get from the zoning rules. So there's things like unit size, like what's the minimum size for a single bedroom home, or what's the minimum size for a 1-unit dwelling inside of a 4-family home. And then you have things like maximum bedrooms, maximum units. And there's a whole lot more information that goes into zoning. This is just kind of like the bare bones of it. There's stuff, I mean, I've seen everything you can imagine, including sort of audible things like how many decibels you're allowed to generate on your property. So we're not going to focus on everything because you could really lose the forest for the trees. We're really going to focus on the things that are most important to environmental conservation, to affordable housing development, to things that are like really core, and maybe not so much all of that extra detail that we don't necessarily need to do. So I did want to mention sort of what are the applications of this. And I know people must know there's a housing affordability crisis in Vermont. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. Basically, VHFA, the Vermont Housing Finance Authority, has estimated that we need 35 to 40,000 more units of available housing by 2030 in order to meet the current need for housing. So that's not even meeting the need of maybe additional influx that might come in the next few years. So we need that to happen, and that's at a rate that's more than double what we've averaged over the last 5 years. So in terms of how much housing we've developed in the last 5 years, we need to increase that way more than really is reasonable. And one of the big barriers to that is zoning, because if you have to go through a public hearing and a bunch of other sort of bureaucratic or administrative regulatory requirements in order to build any housing, sometimes it makes it too expensive for it to be worth the developer's time, or it might make it just not possible at all. It might be entirely prohibited in an area where it would be really helpful to have that housing. So looking at that, plus Vermont has recently had a historic bill that amended our land use law for the first time in the last 50 years. There's a lot going on in zoning. And so we're going to capture a period of very significant historic change in Vermont, not only the codes that we catalog now, but codes that get cataloged in the future. We can see how they change over time. So for those who are interested in climate change, some of the interface between zoning and climate change resiliency is that if you zone an area, the way that you zone an area will affect how well you're able to prevent suburban sprawl, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, looking at the spatial relationship between where housing is and where transit hubs are is really important to try to promote people using public transportation and relying less on private owner vehicles. We also want to zone in a way that reduces forest and farmland loss, because those are sort of the lungs of our planet and is also the food production for our people. And so we want to think of how can we prevent suburban sprawl? How can we sort of densify what we have and leverage what we already have in order to sort of not only to serve the people, but also to serve the planet? And so that's sort of what we're looking at here. We also want to look at things like reducing energy consumption and pollution in urban areas too. So a lot of what we're doing is going to support those kinds of efforts through smart zoning. Also, economic development is another area that's impacted by the way that we zone. Things like property values are going to be affected by what you can and can't do with your property, as well as what the density of your neighborhood is, or what the sort of the structural requirements are for that neighborhood. You're going to want to optimize tax revenues by maybe allowing people to increase their income through ADU development, accessory dwelling unit development. Some of it can do things like promote economic growth and job creation by facilitating more housing development, which brings builders, brings construction companies. Those people are also eating while they're in town. They're, doing the things that they need to do, so they're spending money, and that's going to help your town out too. So we want to try to promote as much as we can healthy, sustainable community development, and so zoning helps us to do that. And I just have a whole bunch of these slides. I'm going to zip through them. So public transit, again, we want to optimize public transit use, and the way to do that is through smart zoning at other things too. And of course, we have a history of segregation in this country. We're actually more segregated now than we were 40 years ago. And part of that is around things like housing policy that has been explicitly and implicitly racist and has been segregationist throughout history. So some of what we want to do is look at our zoning rules and say, does that work for us? Is it working for our communities, or is it serving to continue to further separate people from one another and create barriers to sort of community integration? So some of that is going to be looking at mixed use development, eliminating those old exclusionary zoning practices that never served anyone and certainly don't serve us today. We want to incentivize equitable and affordable housing development so that people from all backgrounds and all communities can afford to live with one another. And we want to do things like, for me, prevent and address homelessness, which is an important equity question too. So some of the findings that they've had in other areas, New Hampshire, for example, found that lot size requirements were preventing housing development for them. So to build housing on your lot, you had to have a pretty sizable lot. And so people wouldn't be able to afford to do that. And people with smaller lots weren't able to sort of expand their housing. So that was something they were able to recognize using their zoning atlas. As well, they determined that attached ADUs had been permitted, but there were such extensive sort of approval and public hearing processes that people weren't able to realistically access them either. So they were able to see that just permission isn't necessarily the requirement that's important. It's you also have to have sort of realistic expectations around what people are able to do and able to afford in order to be able to increase housing. And they determined that permitted by right isn't all, again, it's necessary but not sufficient. Sometimes you have a permissible use in a particular district, but that district doesn't have developable land. So even though it's permitted, realistically, it's not happening. And like we mentioned, Connecticut, they've had issues with primarily residential, was typically meant primarily single family. When you went to a residentially zoned area, typically you weren't allowed to do larger developments like 4-family homes. And they found that transit was inaccessible to those who were most likely to want to access it. So multifamily housing was usually prohibited within that 10-minute walking distance from a person's home to transit hubs. So they, again, were able to see that visually on the zoning atlas, and that was why it was really important to making those kinds of policy arguments and to changing the landscape in Connecticut. So I wanted to maybe demo a live atlas. I want to check in with people, see if people have questions so far. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so I can see all of you. Does anyone have anything specific they want to ask about now? And if no one has anything to say, that's okay too. Okay. So I sent people, first of all, let me ask, does anyone not have access to the Slack? Let me know now. Okay. In Slack, I have some links that you can take a look at in the general channel. So I would love it if you opened up. There's the Connecticut Zoning Atlas, and I'm also going to send the link to the chat here so you can take a look at it there. And I just wanted people to get a sense of the power of a zoning atlas by playing around with one and seeing what it's like. So I'll put it here. I want you to check out that link. And because we only have so many people, I would love it if people just chatted out loud, which I know is everyone's favorite thing to do online. But so you can take a look at this map, and basically what you're seeing is that you've got different types of zoning district. They have it broken down into primarily residential, mixed use with residential. That's typically like a commercial and residential zone. And then non-residential, which is something that prohibits any kind of land. And on their zoning atlas, you can select, for example, which permitted residential uses you're interested in. So you might say, I want to find everywhere. You might click the box in front of 4+ family housing. And that will take away anywhere that that you're not looking at the 1, 2, or 3 family housing. It's just going to look at 4-family housing, and it's going to say, where is it allowed as of right, or where is it allowed after public hearing? So 4-family housing is allowed as of right everywhere you see when you click that box. But if you unclick allowed as of right, this will show you where public hearing is. And you can kind of start to see the differences between what is allowable and what's not, sort of geospatially. You can also, I'm going to click all of my boxes, 1, 2, 3, and 4-family housing. Or maybe I'll unclick everybody. I'm going to. Okay, so I click the X that makes everything go away. I want you guys to sort of play around for the next like 5 minutes. Just sort of look at it, get a feel for it. You can see there are also some other overlays that you can look at, like waterways, state and public lands, sewer service areas, transit stations. You can kind of take a look. I would love to hear any insights that people have as they sort of mess around with the interface.
Yeah, I would just say it's nice to see this overlay on sewer service stations and waterways, which I'm guessing maybe waterways are like public water services. I don't know if that's the case. Oh no, it actually looks like it's just rivers and stuff. But yeah, looking at the connection of like where there is some sort of public service and where density should exist is kind of nice.
Yeah, you brought up the waterways, which are really important in Vermont. We need to know where water and sewer access is possible. And so that, you're right, Connecticut is just looking at rivers and streams and stuff like that. But I know that Vermont has asked, like, can we look at how we could visualize the overlay of sewer service access with our zoning districts, because some districts will say you're allowed to have 4-family homes as long as they have sewer service access. And so if you have a huge district and only this much of the district allows sewer service access, then really realistically, that's the only part of the district where you'll be able to have that 4-family housing, even if it's allowed by right everywhere. So yes, that is an important overlay. Other people, other thoughts?
Yeah, that I just want to say that's what Yoshi said. I mean, a lot of what we ended up coding this summer, technically 4-family houses, 4+ family housing is available and acceptable in the district, but again, the septic has to be there, and that seems to be one of our biggest issues in Vermont right now is we can rezone something higher density, but we still don't have the septic capacity and the water and sewer can really handle it. So it's something the legislature is addressing right now, but so it'll be interesting to see. But I think sometimes we might be able to see that it's 4-family housing available, but really in reality, it's still going to be pretty tricky until we get that water and sewer.
Any other thoughts? And you don't have to have thoughts. I can go on to the next section. I just know people get tired of hearing me talk and talk and talk.
I always think it's super interesting to play around with like where multifamily is allowed versus like the transit stations. Yeah, I do think that eventually we should think about how to show like at least the frequent bus lines in Vermont. That they seem to only have like rail stations and like the Hartford fast, like their BRT system, and not like small bus service. But I feel like there's a pretty limited number of like frequently served bus routes in Vermont that it could be reasonable to do.
Yeah, I noticed that too. I went to their FAQs on their website and they were like, what is public transit? And they said, we do not include bus lines in public transit. I was like, but that's the public transit everybody uses. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I think Google gave up on it first and then everyone else did.
Wow, that's a sad story, but probably a true story. Okay, so if people are not feeling like they want to jump in and chat, if you're all feeling shy, that's totally fine. Just so you know, by the way, this is the world's most laid back gig. Like, I am the most not professional person you'll ever meet. So don't feel like, oh no, I'm going to say the wrong thing. I say the wrong thing 99% of the time. And you just listen to me because I'm the person who ordered the meeting. It's fine. It's fine. It's going to be okay. We're all going to get through it together. So let me just talk a little bit about the structure of how it works so you can know what to expect. I will go back. Oh, I have to do my screen sharing again. Screen share. And I'm going to do the PowerPoint slideshow. Okay. Can you see my screen? Is it a PowerPoint? Okay. So we went through demoing a live atlas. Here's structure and workflow. So generally speaking, our work is to gather Vermont data around zoning, to interpret and encode those regulations according to the standardized methodology that's been piloted by the National Zoning Atlas. The GIS team reviews GIS files and kind of cleans them up and gets them in a format in meeting data standards that are propagated by the National Zoning Atlas. Sometimes also there are some additional things that we do for Vermont, but we've eliminated a lot of those things recently, so it's going to be a lot more simpler than it was in the past. Then we upload the zoning code information and the GIS file at the same time to the National Zoning Atlas website, like their portal. That joins all of the data in the background, and now we have a beautifully formatted GeoJSON with all of the attributes, all the zoning attributes for each of those districts. So We're going to get all the information on the residential district and the urban district and the museum district in Burlington. We're going to figure out what buildings are allowed, where people are allowed to build homes, and then we're going to create like a big sort of like database in the background of that information. We're going to get a map of Burlington. We're going to make it pretty, and then we're going to send it all to the zoning atlas so that they get joined together, and it sends it back to us all perfectly formatted so that it can be sort of compared across jurisdictions and across the U.S. And then we want to take that information and make it available to our Vermont stakeholders so that if they want to play with it in the background or change some of the values or change some of what they're doing so that it's more useful to people in Vermont, that is possible to do. Our team structure basically is this. I am the project manager. I'm the little black box in the middle. I do a lot of coordinating and logistics for this project. I'm advised by a steering committee of stakeholders who are really multidisciplinary and from a whole lot of different organizations. We've got people from the state, we've got people from Middlebury, we've got people from private organizations, I've got citizens who are interested in being involved. And basically, this is a group of people that I go to and I say, hey, everybody, we're building a zoning atlas. What would make it useful for you? What's going to make this something that you are actually going to interact with in the future? And what kinds of data might be important to Vermont that aren't important to other states that we should be trying to capture? So the steering committee kind of gives us some guidance, gives us a framework. We create things according to their framework, bring it back to them for their feedback and their thoughts, and then we sort of revise our workflow as we go along according to their feedback. The National Zoning Atlas also has a learning collaborative of project directors across the entire United States. You all can also join the National Zoning Atlas Slack workspace and get sort of like tips and ideas from them on things that come up for us that maybe haven't come up in other states. They're not covered in their how-to guide. So for example, in Vermont, we have this issue where we have a lot of overlay districts. These are districts that go on top of base districts and maybe change some of the rules in the base district. But when you have like a whole bunch of those overlays, sometimes it gets confusing which rule is the right rule that you're going to follow for a particular place. And so we had that issue. We had to talk to the National Zoning Atlas about it because they had not encountered that in states prior to us. So they needed to sort of like wrap their heads around it and develop a methodology that would work for everybody. So it's really an iterative process. We are the classic example of building the bicycle while you're riding it. We're all working together to develop this system, and there's a lot of sort of dialectical back and forth and building new things that's happening all the time. So the National Zoning Atlas is really kind of, they're steering the whole national ship, but we're also a very important part of that effort. And so we work with them. They also provide us with a lot of technical support and the software specifically to do this. And then we've got, for you guys, you are on the Atlas build out column. So you're either in the GIS team or the zoning team, or if you're really special, you can do work for both teams. Then you get the super, super gold star because I love you the best. And so that's what you would do is sort of your set of tasks, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So big picture project. Right now, the Zoning Atlas as an entity, like the National Zoning Atlas, the Vermont Zoning Atlas, has these kind of like phases that you would think of in terms of our project overview. We've had a planning period where Michael and I talked to a lot of stakeholders, built up that advisory committee, got information from them about what we wanted to have happen inside of our zoning atlas. And so we had a planning period. Where we are now is really the build out period. So based on their feedback, based on the National Zoning Atlas rules, we kind of came up with what we're collecting, and you all are the ones who are building it. And then next, what will happen in the future will be we'll publish it so that it's openly available to anyone and the data is openly available to anyone who needs it. We'll launch that, probably have some kind of sort of public relations events where we tell people about it and get people engaged and using the tools so that they can start to see its utility and start to apply it to different policy questions. And then finally, we'll need to hand it off to another entity for long-term curation because Michael and I are just students and we're not here forever and ever doing this project. Maybe I am, who knows? So the build out workflow, this is the phase that we're in. Really, the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to retrieve the data that we need from the various sources. All zoning data is publicly available. So hopefully it's on the internet. Hopefully you can just Google Burlington zoning regulations and you can pull the most recent version of those zoning regulations. If it's not available online, then one of us can try to reach out to the zoning administrator for that town and have them send it to us. But it is all publicly available, and as long as we are polite and kind and lovely people, we can generally get that from the zoning administrators. They'll give us the information that they have. We have to bear in mind that Vermont is a very rural state, and there are a lot of jurisdictions that are very small. They may have part-time or volunteer planning staff. They might not have people who work full-time, so we just want to be patient and work with people where they are and with whatever capacity they have, whatever software or technology they have at their disposal. We're going to get copies of their zoning regulations, their official zoning map, which is not the geospatial map. The official zoning map is generally like a PDF of a map that someone has like hand drawn or used software to draw, and that tells you where all of the district boundaries are within a jurisdiction. And then once we get that and also the geospatial shape files, then I would assign that jurisdiction to the two teams. Generally, you would have maybe two people working on the zoning questions and then one person who's working on the geospatial file cleanup. Then those two teams kind of separate, do their own thing. The zoning code analysts are going to catalog the rules according to the methodology. The geospatial team is going to clean up the file and ensure that it meets National Zoning Atlas standards. Then both people are going to sort of upload it into this editor. I'll review it and either approve it and send it and set it for publication, or I'll return it for edits if there are any kind of questions or anything that's maybe a little wonky. You know, sometimes we have issues with editor and the geospatial files not always agreeing. So sometimes I have to work with people to kind of get them to work with the editor tool. And then finally, eventually, this will all get pushed to the Atlas viewer, which right now is only living inside of the National Zoning Atlas editor tool, like their online system, but will be published soon, sometime this fall. So they're waiting for a couple more states to finish out. We might be one of those states. And once they have like 4 or 5 states that have completed their entire state, they're going to publish the entire thing online and it will be publicly available. So, so that will be happening hopefully sometime this fall. So zoning analysts, my people, some of your workflow is to make your life easier by looking at tables. Tables are things that exist inside of zoning regulations, and they make all of our lives so much better. It's really a summary of all the zoning information that you need, broken down by district and broken down by rule. It's very much similar to what we're doing, except that it might use different language from the National Zoning Atlas methodology, and it might not be able to 100% capture everything that's happening in a district, so you kind of have to also read the rules too. But the zoning tables are really nice for getting kind of oriented within a jurisdiction. So a jurisdiction, again, is like a town or a city or a village. So you might say, I'm going to look at the use table for Burlington, and it will tell you, like, in District 1, you're allowed to build family housing. In District 2, you're not allowed to build single family housing. In District 3, you're allowed to build it sometimes, but not other times. And so when you look at that table, you'll be able to answer, you'll be able to code some of the district information really quickly inside of Editor. And then sometimes it'll be a little vague or it might be missing from the table. And so you need to go into the regulations and really like suss out what is it, what in the text of the code will help me fill those gaps or make sure that I've interpreted that table correctly. Next, you're going to assign a value for each attribute according to the National Zoning Atlas methodology. So within Vermont, we sometimes say that an action is permitted, which means that you might need to get a permit to do it. Sometimes you have to get a site plan review, which is like you go to an architect maybe and get a site plan, or I'm not actually 100% sure what site plans are, but they are a thing. Sometimes you have to get that approved by a board. Sometimes you have to get something called conditional use review, which is a whole other level of analysis. These are not terms that exist in the National Zoning Atlas methodology. So you have to figure out what those terms sort of map to for that jurisdiction in that district within the National Zoning Atlas methodologies. National Zoning Atlas just wants to know, do you have to go through a public hearing, or is it allowed by right, or is it conditional? Like maybe it's not a public hearing, but somebody has to approve it. So if you know, like for a conditional use review, which one of those things is true, whether it is or is not going to require a public hearing, then you can map it easily according to the National Zoning Atlas methodology. And then you want to double check with me if you're not sure about something. But first, start with the how-to guide, because there is extensive documentation in the how-to guide that will tell you how to map those values for most jurisdictions. And then every once in a while, you'll just come across something really funky and you can ask me or Emily Sun, who is also our our zoning analyst team lead, and we can help you clarify anything. Sometimes we have to check in with National too to find out what the answer is. And then you enter it all in the editor, you save it, and you flag it for review. And I will be showing you what editor looks like very soon. So geospatial team, also my buddies, because I am learning geospatial a lot as I go along. And I have to say it's pretty tricky for me, but I'm getting the hang of it. So the first thing you want to do from the geospatial side is you want to check that map for consistency with the official map. So you might get like a geospatial file and it has all these districts and it has all these sort of polygons. They look really nice, but they represent a zoning scheme from 10 years ago. So they might not be the most up-to-date shape files that you could have, or maybe there's errors in it, or whatever. So sometimes you don't even have a file, but please God, hopefully that's not that often. Then you have to manually draw them. So hopefully we won't have to do that. But for the most part, what you're doing is you're geo-referencing. That's taking the static map and the geo shapefile, and you're checking to see that they sort of line up with one another and that the district boundaries are the same or equivalent in both maps. Then what you want to do is format it so that each polygon is represented by a single row of data, or each district is a single row of data. So you might have a district that has lots of parts, like lots of weird little like islands. So you might have something like the forest district. And so there's like 5 forests in this this town, but they're all kind of like separate, and so they're represented by different little polygons, like 5 little polygons. And you need to create something like a multi-polygon, which is a single row of data that captures the attributes for all 5 of those forests. And so that's something you have to do. You have to dissolve those polygons on something that identifies them uniquely as a district, so that each district is represented by only a single row, which I will also show you in the geospatial part of this training. You're also going to do something called topology repair. This is where you're looking for issues with the shapes themselves. So the polygons that represent the districts, sometimes they overlap. Sometimes there are gaps between them that shouldn't be there. Sometimes they're like weird, funky shapes that aren't legitimate shapes, like they might not be closed, in which case they're not a real polygon. They're just like a line and there's a gap. So you need to fix all of those errors so that way when it uploads into the National Zoning Atlas interface, that any particular point is associated with a single base district, and it must be associated with a base district. So the way to do that is to fix any topology errors. You're also going to edit attributes inside of a table. That's basically, there's just a table of information that is associated with the districts. Each line represents a district's rules, and you want to format that table so that it will upload properly into the National Zoning Atlas website. And this is definitely not rocket science. This is my favorite part because it's the thing that I can do really easily, and it reminds me a lot of Excel. So you're just going to like make sure that everything is sort of like has the right title and has the right capitalization, and you're going to be good. And then finally, you want to make sure that the file coordinate system that you're using is the one that's going to work with the National Zoning Atlas. If you know anything about maps, you would know that flat maps are trying to encode what is essentially like a spherical surface on the surface of the Earth. So when you create a map, sometimes it's not, like depending on the way the map is developed, it may not represent the size of the county the correct way. It might not represent spatial relationships in a really easy to understand way. There are different ways of projecting maps, and so you want to make sure the projection that you're using is one that's going to work for the National Zoning Atlas website. Lastly, I just want to mention project management. I'm a big Slack person, so you really need to be involved in our Slack workspace if you can. If you absolutely hate Slack or you can't do Slack, we can do email. That's totally fine, but I sometimes overlook people who are email only, so you can also text me. You can always use my phone and call me up. I don't care. But just if you meet in Slack, I very much recommend it. So anyone who does not have Slack access or who feels super, super uncomfortable with Slack, let me know after this training so that I can make sure that you are looped in on everything. All right, so with that, I'm going to take another pause and check for questions. That was a lot of information. Someone should have questions. Hi, Mohammed. Wow, I was so clear. Everybody understood everything. I can't believe that. Lies, lies. Michael, come up with a fake question so people feel like really comfortable asking questions.
Yoshi, you mentioned something about the coordinate systems and the world being, the curvature of the Earth. Are you assuming that the world is actually not flat?
That's a really good question, Eric. I am assuming that we live on a non-flat surface. If you don't think we live on a non-flat surface, this may not be the volunteer opportunity for you.
There is a website, the Flat Earth Society, that still exists if you want to visit it.
Man, their projection system must be so simple. I'm so jealous. I need to join them so that we never
Very simple. Yeah.
Zero distortion.
All right, so people are shy. Okay, anyone has, I think I heard a question. I heard
I could jump in with a question, sure. You might be getting to this later, but like, is there a minimum skills for each of these?
Very good question. There is a zero minimum skills. This is the lowest barrier to anything. Like I always say, I will hire you if you have a heartbeat. Like I came into this with no experience at all in zoning, and I still have like much less than, for example, Michael or Bill. My God, I have like no experience compared to most people, but I can read a code. I can read really carefully. So for the most part, I think I can understand what's happening in the codes. The GIS I had to learn completely on my own because like all of my GIS people all finished at the same time over the summer. And I realized, oh my God, I've got to finish all this stuff by myself. So I figured it all on my own. And I will say, I think I did at least a C+ job. I'm not amazing. I'm not going to say that like my district boundaries are perfect within 7 centimeters of accuracy. But we have to remember, this is a policy tool that we're creating. This isn't like, it's not like something that's going to be used to like, I don't know, save the planet. I mean, I guess it will, but but it's like, if you need to know, like, is this point within this district or that district? We know that with a reasonable level of certainty. Like every once in a while, maybe like the line is 5 feet farther to the east than it should be. Like, I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about being able to communicate to people is 85% of Vermont won't allow you to do X. Like that's important. And so as long as you're okay with not being perfect, this is a great team for you. It is okay if you don't have a lot of experience, but if you have experience, I recommend that you stick with the role that you feel really comfortable with already, as opposed to trying to like take on something that you don't know anything about. And that's also okay, but just, it'll make you feel more, it'll be more fun for you. People might also want to know about required like number of hours. That's really just up to you and what your situation is. Some people may be taking this as a class for credit. Some people are getting paid by the school or by an external funder. If you're getting paid, then work it out with whoever it is that you're getting funded by, how much you have to work for them. I personally just care that you're here today. That's enough for me. Like this is also an experience where I'm getting the word out about how important zoning is. So like, if you can come for 10 hours this semester, that's great. If you can come for 5 hours this semester and do some coding, that's great. If you want to do 10 hours a week, even better. But I will be happy and appreciative of everything you do, no matter how much or how little it is. We are volunteers. We are not getting, I'm not getting paid for this, so do what you can. Any other questions before I move on to the geospatial stuff? All right, rock and roll. Let's do geospatial. All right. So like I mentioned earlier, we do live on a curved planet. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to access any geospatial files that already exist. And for the most part, Vermont has most of their zoning districts already geospatially mapped. That's because we have this system of regional planning commissions, and they work with the towns and the cities to make sure that everybody gets their zoning stuff into geospatial format. So there's this lovely website called the Vermont Open Geodata Portal that you can go to, and you can download a GeoJSON or a shapefile or CSV, all this information you can download. And what I always recommend, for myself anyway, has been to start with GeoJSONs. If you're not familiar with what a JSON is, it's just a file format. And it basically creates a dictionary of information. And that it's a little bit less intimidating than shape files that have a much more structured format, and there's a lot more information going on. Like, just, you can think of a GeoJSON as just a dictionary, and it makes things a little bit like more simple for you. Also, it is the required format for uploading to the National Zoning Atlas people. So no matter what you download, eventually you're going to have to upload a GeoJSON. So if you want to start with a GeoJSON, that might make your life easier in some circumstances. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to download, this is Underhill, the town of Underhill in Vermont. So if you downloaded its GeoJSON, it would represent this in terms of data. And then you'd want to cross-reference it. You want to geo-reference it with the official static map. So here you can see the static map of the zoning districts in Underhill. So you've got the residential area that's shaded like that. So you're like, oh, okay.
Hey, Yoshi,
Yes.
Yoshi,
Yeah.
I don't think you're sharing your screen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That sounds about right. Let's do that, shall we?
You were on such a roll. I didn't want to interrupt you, but we had no idea what you were looking at.
Always interrupt me. I'm always on a roll, and I will never stop talking if you don't interrupt. So please do. So here we are. We're in Underhill. You want to access, and so okay. Again, we're going to download this from the from Vermont. Can you see the Vermont Open Geodata portal up here, where I'm kind of pointing to?
Yeah, we can see that.
Yes.
Okay, all right, sweet. So this is the Vermont Open Geodata portal. You can download here in this format, the GeoJSON, like I mentioned. These are the other formats you can download. I know that Bill was working, his team was working with shape files for a while. I don't know if that's where you landed long term, but I basically just always downloaded the GeoJSON because that was like the most straightforward, easiest thing to work with, and because it's what I would have to upload eventually anyway. So if you don't know what any of those things are, don't worry, you will learn through this and it will be fun. So the GeoJSON is where I started. I would download the file that was associated with this GIS mapping of the districts in Underhill. But here you have the static official zoning map. You can see it's kind of shaded where you would have residential. The residential's oh gosh, I'm not great at this. So anyway, basically you've got different ways of knowing this here is one single district that might connect over here to this district because they're both shaded the same. And you say, okay, well, this looks the same kind of as that map, but there's a way within GIS software to take the two maps, line them up, and make sure that they're exactly coordinate with one another. So that's something that we can have wonderful Bill Hegman talk about next, because that is a thing that I've actually never done myself, and he knows how to do it. But I will just quickly walk through the steps of what you're going to do, and then we can, oh, sorry, it's very loud. Then we can kind of do it all together. So this is, I mentioned dissolving polygons. So when you open up a layer, a GIS layer in GIS software for the first time, you're going to be able to see, okay, well, here we have like all of this purple is one zoning district, but it might have two parts that aren't joined with one another. So you've got like this kind of giant purple thing here, and then another little purple thing over here. This blue one seems to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, like 11 different parts. So what you want to do is dissolve that into a single polygon so that it's represented in the data. All of those have the same attributes. They all have the same rules because they're all the same district. So instead of having lines that represent each one of those polygons, you're going to have one line. It's going to capture all of them, and it's going to have the rules that are consistent across all of the polygons. So you would figure out what's the unique identifier for that district, and then you're going to combine those islands into one single multi-polygon representation within the data. You want to check to make sure that every district gets represented. So the people who are in the zoning code team, they're going to give you a list of districts. If you're on the GIS team, you're going to make sure that they actually show up on the map. If they're not showing up on the map, that's something to flag to let someone know, so that maybe we can figure out if we have the wrong map or if we have the wrong rules or something, why there's a discrepancy there. You want to make sure that there aren't districts on the map that aren't in the text. It would be weird if you had something showing up on the map that wasn't described in the text. Not totally impossible, but it would be strange, and we want to figure out what was happening. And some of these GIS files come in with these kind of irrelevant features in them. So I had Winooski's map, for example. They had a whole polygon that was like just the highway, and the highway wasn't part of any zoning district. it was just its own punch out kind of feature that I could delete and say like, okay, we don't need the highway because that's not part of the zoning. So we're not going to upload that to the National Zoning Atlas. Or sometimes they'll have like a river or a lake or something that isn't zoned because you're not going to build anything in the middle of a lake. So that gets sort of punched out and we have to take that out of the map. Some of the tools that you'll find helpful in GIS are the dissolve tool. That's what makes all those multiple polygons come together and merge into one single multi-part polygon. And then I've also used the Mimi GIS tool, which is something that I think Middlebury created, and it's very similar to dissolve. Both of them do very similar things. We're also going to look for topology errors. You're going to use a tool that is called the topology checker, and that will give you a sense. You can build rules into it. So I built a rule into it that said, my polygons can't overlap. My polygons can't have gaps between them that are bigger than so many, meters. And my polygons have to have valid geometries. And so overlapping boundaries happen. That's when you get two districts that maybe are drawn too close to one another. And so there'll be some points that are in both of the districts. And we want to make sure that that's not true for very much land area, because honestly, you want to be able to like identify any point within a jurisdiction with a single base district. And then sometimes you get these gaps because, again, things are just drawn a little funky. And so they kind of diverge where they shouldn't be diverging. And invalid geometries are where you might have somebody who drew a polygon and it has these weird little like loops in them or holes, or like it's not closed all the way, or something's funky happening with the drawing. So the topology checker will alert you to any of these things. It'll flag you to the errors. You can zoom in on the errors, and then you can fix them using some of these different tools that I've listed here. The clipping tool allows you to clip boundaries one to another so that if you have a little bit of a gap, you can kind of seal up that gap. The polygon self-intersection tool will let you figure out where there are overlaps and delete the overlap areas so that you don't have those kind of like areas of intersection. We have something called v.generalize, which you should use sparingly because it can do kind of, it's a kind of like a pre-programmed editing tool that will do all of this for you at once, but every once in a while it also reshapes the district boundaries. So you're like, okay, I don't know that I want to use that all the time, but sometimes it's the only thing that will fix a problem. So I've used that a couple times. v.clean is another one that can clean up errors. I haven't had as many problems with that one in terms of screwing up district boundaries. And then there's tools that delete holes too. So I will show you these in a bit, but they're all helpful ways to handle topology errors. And this is where I would say I spend 99% of my time in GIS is fixing the topology errors. Hot tips. You really want to pay attention to data types. When you're editing an attribute table, it's not like Excel where you can just go in and type information. Like sometimes you have to first identify what type of data you're capturing in a cell, for example, in the attribute table. And you have to know if it's going to be an integer or if it's going to be like a text string or some other type of data. And so or the length of the text string, that matters, so that if you're putting in district names and it's a 50-character district name, it will truncate the district name if it's only a 25-character field. So you want to really pay attention to that so that your attribute tables actually contain the information that you want them to contain fully. It matters what order you run those different topology fixing scripts. Sometimes if you do certain topology scripts will mess up your attribute table. So sometimes you want to like leave that, you want to do them first and then fix the attribute table last. Or you might want to do the attribute table first because, you know, for whatever reason, like you can only do the edits after you've done that. There's just a lot of things you'll notice around order and like what to do first, second, and last. And Bill's team had a great workflow that they developed that I think added to this meeting. So you'll have access to that, and it walks you through all the steps one at a time. You want to look out for things that fix a problem, but then generate new errors. So if you fix a gap, sometimes you fix it by moving a district, but then you don't realize you've actually created an overlap between the two adjacent districts. So you want to really be thoughtful, like you run the topology checker first, you make a fix, and then you run it again to see if you maybe screwed something else up when fixing the first thing. And like I said, checking for any boundary changes. You don't want to make a whole new map, which is beautiful and validates, but doesn't actually represent the zoning districts as they're drawn. You want to be very, very patient because a lot of the time The software is buggy and weird, and it just takes a couple of tries before you get something completely done. And let me know if you encounter anything that's totally unfixable, because sometimes I have uploaded a couple of things that had gaps because they were just not fixable. And so the National Zoning Atlas team was fine with us doing that. This is what editing an attribute table looks like. The attribute table looks a lot like something you'd see in Excel. You're going to add for every one of our jurisdictions, you're going to add a county column. That's the Chittenden County column here. You're going to add a jurisdiction column. So you would, for this one, I think it's Underhill, it would have an additional column that would say Underhill. You're going to add abbreviated district names. So it might be something like RUR, SWT, and those are included in the regulations. You're going to get those from the regulations from the zoning analyst team before you start all of your GIS work. And then you're going to delete any extraneous columns that we don't need, just to kind of keep it tidy. And finally, before we upload it to the National Zoning Atlas, you want to reproject the layer into the correct coordinate system if you need to. You might have had to take it out of a system to do some edits, and then you might have to put it back into a system. You'll get the hang of that as you go along. And you want to save the completed layer as a GeoJSON, because that is the file format that is required. And you're going to upload it to the editor tool and then flag it to me so that I can take a look at it and make sure everything looks all right, and then publish it. And some common errors that I found when people are uploading GIS is either the CRS, a coordinate reference system problem, which happens very occasionally, or there might be a mismatch between the names that you've identified for each district and the names that are in the regulation codes. You got to make sure that they're exactly entered the same. And sometimes you'll just have districts that show up on the map that aren't already an editor, and so we need to make sure that we put those in. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Bill if he wants to talk a little about georeferencing, because that's that really important step in the beginning where you're going to take two maps, overlay them, and make sure that the shape file really matches what's happening in the static map. And then I can show some of the other stuff in QGIS. So go, Bill.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, I'll just, let's see, where is my share right there. So I'm just gonna spend 5 minutes or so, show you about this georeferencing, and then I'm going to put together a video too, so you just don't have to worry about the details right here other than the concepts. But so this is the town of Bridgeport right here, and this is the finished zoning. It's a little funky compared to some other towns, but we had some questions about this zoning and whether or not it was accurate, and some things were missing perhaps. So we wanted to compare it to the official zoning map, which we only had in a PDF format right here. You also notice that this map, this official map here, looks different than this. It's because this one is in what's called a Vermont State Plane Coordinate System. And this one right here is in the GeoJSON format, which gets uploaded to the National Atlas, which the GeoJSON format, the projection that it's in, stretches the features in the east-west direction, especially the further you get from the equator. But so what we first needed to do was to change the projection. Oh, hold on. Oh, sorry, I'm having a little trouble here. Change the projection so that the features look the way they're supposed to. And then what we can do is we're going to also add then some background features here from the OpenStreetMap right in there like that. And then we have we have to find some kinds of features on the map that we want to georeference that are discernible. So for instance, intersections of roads are really good to use, corners of buildings. Other things that are not so great to use, even town boundaries are not that great to use. And also the other things that are not so great are water features. So we can use roads. What we do then is we have a little thing here called a georeferencing tool, and a georeferencer right there. And it opens up, and you can see this, right? Okay. And then we just go in here and add the zoning map right there, and boom, it pops in. This is, and then we start to georeference it. So I think what I'm going to do is I need to find 4 control points for this. Hold on one second here. Let me just find something. Hang on one second. There, that works, and I can highlight my mouse. So I'm going to find 4 control points, one right here and another one over on the here, and then the third one down here and a fourth one over here. They need to be spread across the map. So basically, I'm going to start here and find a control point at Ratlin Bridge Road and Harbor Road. And I can zoom in a little bit there, and then pick up my little tool to zoom around. And then I'm going to go over to my actual canvas and do the same thing and find that same location. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit, and here it is right here, the same spot. And then what you do is you come back here and you add in a point, a control point. So I put it right there. It asks me if I want to type in the coordinates, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go from the map canvas right there. And then I go right here and put in that point. Boom. Now I've got a point in here. And down below it shows that the source was just this PDF file. And then the destination is showing some bigger coordinates that are going to the Vermont State Plane Coordinate System. So it's saying I'm moving from here to here. And then we just do the same thing for the next 3 points right here. Over here, I'm going to go Forest Road and Mountain Road. And so I'm just going to go find that again over here. Forest Road and Mountain Road right here a little bit. Maybe zoom in right there. And then there, from the map canvas, same thing. That one was a little bit off, but we'll call it good for now. And then let's go down here to Hemingway Road and Route 22 right here. So I'm going to find that on my map canvas. I'm going to zoom out a little, go down here till I can find it. It looks like it's right here. So now I come back here, put in my point from the map canvas. There we are. Now I've got 3 points and I just need one more. And I'm going to come over here to Crown Point Road and Liberty Lane, perhaps right in here. And I'm going to go find that on my map over here. Oops, right over here. And that looks pretty good right about there. So I'm going to do this last point right there from the map canvas, and I'm going to do this one right here. And now, oh, wait a minute, sorry, from the map, what happened there? Hold on a second. Let me do this again. There, from the map canvas. Did it do it? Hold on. From the map canvas. Oh, funny. Doesn't usually give me a problem, but we'll take a look and see quick. Where did my thing go? Georeferencing. I haven't had that happen before. Let's try it again right here. There. I'm going to say OK from that. There we go. So something happened there, but it usually works just fine. It must be that I clicked on the wrong place. So one of these is incorrect. And so what I could do is delete one of them and see there, that one looks like it's really far off. So in other words, I can delete this one and add another point. But basically what happens after that is you end up georeferencing the layer, and it will end up looking a lot like this. I'll just add it in since I've already got it right here. I did a little bit of testing of it beforehand to make sure that if something like this happened, that I could recover from it. Let's see. Come on. Come on.
There's nothing like doing this in public.
Yeah, yeah. There we go. There we go. So it is then georeferenced in there. You can see it's actually then done right in the right space. And then this is the completed zoning that kind of lays over the top right there. So that's a great way to get a hard copy map that has no georeferencing onto your map. You might do this if you have, like I said, in this case, a zoning map that just needs to be checked, or there's something that's an error. The other place that you'll do it is we have a lot of overlay layers. And in the state of Vermont, one of the overlay layers that's very common are flood hazard areas, but we don't have them all digitized. So here's the town of Cornwall. And you can see that for Cornwall, we had to go in and georeference all of the flood hazard areas. And then we put those on, and then we had to digitize these flood hazard areas so that then once they were digitized, we had, you can see that we digitized that in like that. So that's another way that you might use this georeferencing tool, probably even more so than maybe for the zoning. You'll find that if you're in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont or some other places, there may be a few towns that don't have digital zoning, but for the most part, they have it. Anyway, that's kind of how it works. I'll put together a little video on that. Does anybody have questions?
How do you know the coordinate reference system that a map is in, the official map?
Yeah, so if this one right here is that GeoJSON file. If you right click on it and you go to the properties of that map, you can see that the information, always remember to right click, you can see the information about it. You can see its coordinate reference system right here, WGS84. That's what we need to upload to the National Atlas. But a lot of the stuff that we get off of the Vermont website, especially if it's a shapefile, will be in Vermont state plane coordinates. And you can work in those as long as you want. But then eventually when you create the GeoJSON file, it needs to be in this WGS84 system. And that's oftentimes, most of the time, if you create a GeoJSON file, it will automatically put it in that WGS84, but you might have to be explicit about it. But you can always find the information by just right-clicking on the layer and going to the properties. And then there's properties of an individual layer, but there's also properties of the whole map. And in this case, my map is actually in a different projection. It's in a Vermont state plane projection, and all the layers, if they're in different projections, are just being reprojected on the fly to match up. But when I work and I do a georeferencing, I put my view in Vermont state plane, and then because most of the original maps, the hard copy maps are in Vermont state plane coordinates, so it just makes it a lot easier.
So do other people have questions?
Okay. Well, you'll get a sense, and if you ever have to use it, I'll put together a little video and you can watch it. You can also, with the nice thing about QGIS is you can almost always search in Google for like QGIS georeferencing, and you'll find 3 or 4 videos. I'll put one together specific for this project, but you'd be able to find other information on it.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'll share my screen and show you a couple more things that you guys can see. So all right, so I'm just going to show you what some of the stuff I mentioned. So here's QGIS. Can you see my Underhill here? Possibly. Yep. I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yes.
So Underhill, so you can see here, this is what QGIS kind of looks like. If you haven't used it before, it can be a little intimidating, and it does feel clunky at first. We have yes, okay. So we have ArcGIS access to through UVM. So the UVM students who are involved on the call, you can get ArcGIS for free through UVM, which is a more widely used software. But this is free and available to anybody. So if anyone's on the call who's not a UVM student, you could use this. And so I can put I'll put the link in the in Slack for how to download this and which version to use. But all of your tools over here will be in like a processing toolbox. So if you get this, this is Underhill, for example, and I'm going to show you. I'm going to color it so you can see things a little more easily. Let's try. Oh,
yeah, while you're doing that, just let me mention quickly that there's also a georeferencing tool in ArcGIS. It's almost identical. So if you found how to do one, you can figure out the other. And again, there are videos online that you could easily find to learn how to use that georeferencing tool too. And it's good. It works really well too.
Sweet. I'm trying to remember, how did I do? I think I did symbology. Okay, so if I wanted to see, for example, I just added the labels so that each label identifies the district that it's on top of, but it's really hard to read. So I like to color things so you can see them in color a little better. So if you go to symbology, you don't have to memorize all of this now. This is all online and I can help you with it the first time you do one. But if you go to symbology, you can do a categorize. That's the, for categorical data, which is things like the names of districts. It's not like a number, it's like a word. So you can classify them and it will show you, oh, it did not work because I didn't pick what I was classifying. I'm going to classify district name. And now you can see a little more easily that this is the soil and water conservation. Anything that's purple is soil and water conservation. This yellow part is the Mount Mansfield Scenic Preservation District. You've got a rural residential district too, Underhill Center Village District, Underhill Flats Village Center. These are all the different districts that are available. And if you wanted to look for something like errors, this is something called a topology checker, this button up here. And I think it's a plugin. So the first time you run QGIS, I'll have to show you how to install it, but you install this and you can look for things like, I want to say, okay, so the layer I'm working in is the Vermont data Underhill zoning layer, and I want it to not have gaps, add that rule. I want the Vermont data layer to not have invalid geometries, add that rule. I also want it to not overlap, not have any overlaps between base districts. Because in general, your base districts are going to cover the entirety of your jurisdiction, and they're not going to overlap with one another. Overlay districts are a separate type of district, which we'll talk about in the next section. And those overlay districts can overlap and should overlap with base districts, but when you're just working in the base districts, those should not have any of those things, invalid geometries, gaps, or overlaps. So now you run the topology checker and it says, oh, I found 4 errors. I found 2 gaps and 2 overlaps. And if you click on one, it'll take you right to that gap. And then you would use one of the tools. Here I'm using the, I think this is the clipping tool. No, the snapping tool. This is the snapping tool that will snap the boundaries together. And then you would just like pull the different vertices together and it does the magic. I'm not going to do it here because whenever you do something publicly, it's inevitable that something will go wrong and confuse people more than they need to be confused. But just trust me on this, that you would just click these things and it joins together and you have a beautiful non-gappy boundary between 2 adjacent layers. If that doesn't work, if you've been messing around with those vertices and trying to make those gaps go away and it's not working, there are other processing tools that you can use. For example, you can use v.clean, which I mentioned, and that is kind of its own little script that's prepackaged inside of QGIS and will do all of that work for you. Sometimes it works beautifully and sometimes it creates problems that you didn't have to begin with. So you always want to take a look and say, okay, what do I want to do? I want to try to run this and see what happens. All right, I ran it. It's doing a bunch of stuff. Maybe it fixed my problems. I'm not sure. So I want to run my topology checker, but this time I'm in a different layer. I'm in my cleaned layer over here in the layers section. So the original was what I was working with before. Now I've cleaned it. and I want to create a topology checker rule list for that, which of course now, and because I'm in public, it's not working. But again, you would just like create a set of rules. Here we go. My rules will be that the cleaned layer must not have gaps, must not have invalid geometries, and must not have overlaps. And then I'm going to run that checker again and see if it fixed my problem. Oh, it looks like it fixed 3 out of the 4 problems. Hooray! And you're like super excited. You're like, yes, I fixed it. So maybe I go to that last error and I fix it myself. Maybe I can get it to work this time. And so that's kind of the process that you're going through. You're going to try different tools, try different approaches to closing gaps, to separating overlaps, and to fixing invalid geometries. And sometimes things are going to work beautifully, and sometimes things are going to fall apart. And you just kind of want to keep at it, be persistent, don't give up. Eventually, you will have a beautiful file that we can upload to the National Zoning Atlas. So that's kind of what the process looks like inside of QGIS for anyone who's never used GIS software before but is interested. Do we have questions on geospatial stuff? I see we have some new people with us, maybe? Oh, maybe I made that up. Junaid, hi. Any questions before I move on to zoning code analysis? I just want to acknowledge that it can be really overwhelming the first time you see QGIS and see the whole GIS workflow, and you may be like, there's no way that I'll ever get all of these weird little things to work together, or that software looks like way overly complicated. It can be, and yet you will also be able to get through it. If I was able to get through it, literally anyone can. It is just going to take you a couple tries and you'll get really good at it, and then you're going to feel great about yourself and you're going to want to do it all the time because you're going to feel like a rock star, and it's not that bad anymore. Okay. So I will move on. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. I can move on to the zoning code regulations now if people are interested in hearing that. If anyone is definitely like, yes, I'm on the GIS team, I have no interest in zoning code analysis, feel free to drop off the call. You do not have to sit here and watch it, but you are also welcome to stay because it's really interesting and fun, I think. All right, I'm going to share my screen again and jump to PowerPoint. So here's the zoning analyst workflow. So I want to talk a little bit about zoning. We've talked some of these, I've used a lot of these words today, and if you don't know what they mean, that's totally okay. I didn't know what they meant when I started either. A jurisdiction is basically a town or a village. There are also these things called GORs in Vermont, which is basically an area where two towns may have been really close together, but weren't quite adjacent to one another. So there's like a little triangular area that is not in either town. Those are like GORs that have their own zoning sometimes. So that's a jurisdiction. It's basically like the big, sort of the big scale thing that we look at, the town or the city. Districts are what comprise those jurisdictions. So a district is an area of land within that jurisdiction where all of the rules are the same. So for the business district, they're going to have all the same rules, and they might be different from the rules for the residential district, which are all the same for everybody who lives in the residential district. So each jurisdiction will have one or more districts involved, and those base districts define the rules of what you're allowed to do with land within the boundaries of that district. An overlay district lays on top of the base district, and it will change the rules for certain parts where they intersect. So you may have a place where you're allowed to build any kind of residential development you want, but maybe it has a river that flows through the middle of it, and there's a flood hazard overlay district. And so within the areas where it's designated as a flood hazard, you're not allowed to build certain types of housing in that area. So you will have a base district, everything is allowable, and the rules are all the same there, except where that intersection happens between the base district and the overlay district. And sometimes you'll have more than one overlay that overlap on top of the base district. That's when things get hairy, but we're not going to worry about that because that was yesterday's problem. Now the zoning atlas is fine with us just defining the rules for each of these things, and they'll visualize it without having to necessarily untangle all the rules for overlapping overlays. Density. Who wants to take a guess at what density is? I would like to hear someone else's voice beside my own. Can anyone define what they think density might be based on what we've talked about so far? If I don't get volunteers, I'm calling on Michael, and we will feel bad for Michael because I'm going to make him answer all of these.
I can take it anyway. I'd say like any kind of regulation that limits like the number of units or bedrooms that can be built like per area of land.
Awesome. Michael knows all of his stuff. So treatment, just in case anyone hasn't heard this, is basically kind of the way that the National Zoning Atlas talks about a residential dwelling. So a single family dwelling, a 2-family dwelling, a 3, 4, or 5+ family dwelling. Like you can have one building in which you have like 5 units of housing, for example. That would be like a 5-family treatment under this National Zoning Atlas methodology. And I've mentioned accessory dwelling units several times during this presentation, so I know somebody's got a good guess at what that could mean, or maybe an example. Let's hear somebody, some brave soul. Don't make me call on Michael again.
Is that kind of like what you were talking about with apartments that can be built like on top of garages? Stuff like that?
Yes, totally, Lorna. Yes, that is. So you can have accessory dwelling units that are part of your primary structure. You can also have them that are separated from your primary structure. So I used to live in somebody's garage that they had turned into an apartment, and it was the best apartment I've ever had, by the way. And the people who owned the house, they lived in the house. So that would be, those are both examples of accessory dwelling units. If I wanted to build a mother-in-law apartment, actually my house right now is a 2-unit, it's a 2-unit home. But if I were to like build something additional onto the property, I think that becomes an accessory dwelling unit. So yes, ADUs are like sort of additional units of housing that you can incorporate into your land to generate more income or allow people to live with you. Who has heard of the term setback? Anybody? Or if you don't know, give it a guess. What do you think a setback is?
I could give it a educated guess. I think it's the space between the road and where the house can be built.
Yes, winner, winner, chicken dinner. That is 100% correct. So your setback could be the front setback. That's how far you have to be back from the road. Your rear setback might be how far forward you have to be from your backwards neighbors. Side setback might be how far you have to be on either side from anything that's adjacent to you, whether it's a road or another building. So setbacks are those things. They sort of tell you how tucked into your property your house has to be. So frontage sounds like setback. It sounds like that front setback, but it's actually different. And this is something that Bill Hegman taught me, and it was really cool. So frontage is how much of the street you're going to occupy. So you could have a property that's like 10, I don't know, 10 acres by 10 acres. But if you have a frontage requirement of 1 acre, you could have like a really long, skinny property that's only 1 acre by 10 acres. But if your frontage requirement is something like, I'm sorry, that's the opposite. That's if you have 9 acres of frontage. But if you have 1 acre of frontage, then you only have to have like a certain amount of street that you're on the front of. So it's like, I'm going to call on Bill to explain this better than what I'm doing right now. But basically that's it. It's how much of the street you have to take up. Like how it determines the area of the land that you're building on.
Is that designed to eliminate spaghetti lots? Is that what the purpose of that is?
That is what I understand.
A little bit. It is. Requires a certain amount. Like if you have a 10-acre zone, then you're going to have a lot of frontage. It's going to force it to be a wider lot instead of deeper. Yeah, that's exactly what it's made for. In some cases, though, like it can be a real deterrent. Like in a 1-acre zoning, sometimes they still make you have a lot of frontage, like 180 feet of frontage or 200 feet of frontage, and then or even in a 1/2-acre zone, sometimes they do a lot of frontage, so it prevents the person from splitting the lot up. So towns are looking at this frontage too, but in some of those more rural zones, yeah, definitely it kind of limits the spaghetti lots.
I should mention too, with respect to setback, that something we've seen in regulations is that if you have a requirement of a lawn of a certain size, that counts as a setback requirement, even if it's not called that in the regulations. So sometimes these words that we're talking about here are sort of the technical terms that are used in the methodology or might be used in a lot of zoning codes, but there may be other ways that they're referred to too. So that's why it's important to kind of like give that whole text a scan, because even if you don't see something show up in a use table, like you might not have the word setback in the use table, it might be somewhere else listed as like required lawn dimensions or something like that. So you kind of want to read the whole text, at least scan it to have a sense of like what might be referring to one of these things through another term. Has anyone heard of planned residential developments or planned unit developments? If not, don't worry. So this is basically when you have, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pull up on our, let's see, on our Teams. I think I sent out to everybody the file that has, oh, just kidding, not here. Hold on. I have a thing in here that I hope I can find. Training materials, training packet, here we go. All right, so I just want to say I sent to you guys all a training packet, and in here it has definitions, some like user-friendly definitions of what these terms are. So if you want to see what a planned residential or unit development is, here we go. A developer proposes to build a planned residential development when she wants to build a structure or structures that will be used only for residential purposes, and it requires more than one parcel of land. So if you are not familiar with the term, feel free to go through the training packet that I gave you that has a lot of the information that we've already covered today, and also has like these workflows, for example, also has this glossary that'll help you know what some of these terms mean. All right, and then we talked about, oh, we didn't talk about form-based code, but I did mention the GORs where like two areas of land come together and you have like a weird triangle. We do have a couple of those in Vermont. Has anyone heard of form-based code? I am going to call on Michael to talk about form-based code.
As far as I know, form-based code is basically like changing from regulating specific uses like residential or commercial or industrial, and instead just like regulating the dimensions of a structure, like the setbacks, like how high it can be and things like that, without like explicitly regulating use.
Excellent. Yes, and we do have some form-based code throughout Vermont, so you'll run into it sometimes. And it can be a little confusing how you would code that inside of the editor tool, because it may not sort of align with their predetermined value set, but that's okay. We can talk about that when you get there. So here we have the variables and the values. So the type of data that we collect include things that identify each jurisdiction and district uniquely. So that might be the jurisdiction name, it might be who it is at the jurisdiction that is the planner. It could be things like what type of district are you talking about? Is it a residential district versus a non-residential district? And it can be things like, is this district mapped or not mapped? Is it extinct but still on the map? Is it an overlay or a base district? So there's a lot of like just basic information about the type of jurisdiction and district that you're looking at. And then you have things that are important, like the use rules. So what uses are allowed? What are the due process requirements in order to be able to invoke that use? So if you want to build a 4-family home, is it going to require a public hearing, or is it not going to require a public hearing? Is it prohibited? If it's an overlay district, does it overrule the base district or does it not? So these are all different variables that you're going to be collecting information on. So you've got the identifying information, you've got the due process requirements, the use that's allowable, and then you also have dimensional standards. So things like the setbacks and how large your lot has to be, or how many stories you can have for your building, whether or not you can have a mobile home park. So all of this data is what we're collecting, and I have included in the training packet sort of a table of the data and then what type of data it is. So things like jurisdiction, you're just gonna, that that's text, that's gonna be the name of the jurisdiction. But some of these are value restricted. So is it an affordable housing district? You would have to say yes or no. There is no like maybe, there is no other information that you could put in there. It's just yes or no. So you'll get into the editor tool, which I'll show you at the end of this, and it gives you the choices that you're allowed to select for those different districts, with some flexibility and some places where you can enter information otherwise that maybe isn't captured through those values, which I'll also show you. But for the most part, you're restricted to text, whole number, decimal, or certain value menus that are predetermined by the National Zoning Atlas people. We do have some fields that are Vermont specific that aren't collected by the National Zoning Atlas. So we get that information because Vermont stakeholders have said it's important to them, but it won't be comparable across the country. So you won't be able to see in California what's happening with conditional use review because they may not have that in their regulations, or they're just not collecting that data. We are, but they're not. So we have some information that we're collecting specific to Vermont too. All right, so to get your bearings, the first thing you're going to want to look at in your tool or in your regulations, and I sent out the Underhill regulations with this training invite, you want to look at the table of contents. I mean, that seems really basic, but a lot of people just skip and start reading. The table of contents will tell you like how to make your search more efficient. So it'll tell you where in maybe 450 pages of zoning, you're going to find the information on the rural residential district, or where that zoning district list is, or where the use table is. All of those things are like really quick references that will move you through the regulations faster. So you're not spending hundreds of pages like reading about things that we're not collecting data on. So look for maps, look for summary tables, look for district specific sections and maybe topic specific sections like lot, yard, and setback requirements. And then you can just sort of zoom to those places, or like Control F, find public hearing, look for where public hearing is mentioned, and see if that's something that we can more quickly populate our database with. Now, tables, like I said, they are your best friends. So you want to work that magic. Look through here and you're like, all right, my principal minimum setback, front, side, and rear. I get it for every single district. So in Underhill, in the Flats Village Center, front setback is 0, side setback is 20, rear setback minimum 20 feet. So you can get that information quickly, and you can just upload it directly into Editor, and that goes nice and easy. Sometimes you have a little bit of a question mark for yourself. So for here, you have accessory dwelling. There's a P/C, and you're like, well, permitted use and conditional use. Is there a time where it's permitted and a time where it's conditional? This you couldn't easily just quickly go from the use table right into Editor and giving it a value assignment. This you might need to read the zoning regulations to really get a sense of what's going on. But you can get some of the stuff. I generally think that the most helpful information in the district summary table is the dimensional standards, because that's typically just numbers, and they do a pretty good job of just putting that information in black and white and in an easy to interpret format there. And sometimes you'll have additional tables, not just the district summary table. You might also have things like, oh, here's a table about multi-dwelling structures. So this is just about multifamily housing. So 2, 3, 4+ family housing, and they'll have additional requirements that maybe aren't captured within the district summaries table. So again, you can get quick information at a glance there without having to read hundreds of pages of text, though you should really verify afterwards that there isn't more in the text that wasn't represented in the table that you need to incorporate. You want to check definitions. So you may say, okay, well, the table says that this use is permitted. Does that mean it's allowed conditional? Or does it mean that it requires a public hearing? Well, you would look up, for example, the development review process, and you would say, what does the development review process require? And then it might say like, okay, well, applications for site plan or conditional use review shall be submitted to the zoning administrator. And then in consultation with the chair of the development review board, they'll schedule a public hearing. So that might tell you, okay, anything that's identified in this table as being permitted or conditional use review is going to require a public hearing. So everything is going to get the public hearing value. That helps you to map the code-specific term to the National Zoning Atlas methodology term. So that's important to check your definitions. You want to clarify any ambiguity. Like I said, if you have like more than one value in that use table, you're going to want to go zip yourself over to the section that describes that district and see what the rules are that will clarify when is something a P or a permitted use and when is it a conditional use And because sometimes you'll have two different National Zoning Atlas values. One could be it's permitted, means that it's allowed, and then conditional could mean that you need a public hearing. So to get that information, you need to flesh it out in the text of the regulations. And if you get confused, if you're reading these and you're like, I have no idea what requires a public hearing and what doesn't, fill out as much as you can of the stuff that isn't confusing you, and then reach out to me or to Emily Sun, who is the team leader for our zoning analyst team, and we can help clarify it. But first, I should say, always first, start by reading the Zoning Atlas methodology text, which I appended to this appointment in the calendar. If you can't get it from the text, come to us. If we can't get it, we'll bump it up to the National Zoning Atlas people and see what they have to say, because they may have encountered it in another state. Hot tips when it comes to putting your information into the editor. I'll show you, actually, why don't I do a little quick demo of editor first so you can see what I'm talking about. And I'm going to share my screen, but I'm going to go to, where is my Safari? I'm going to go to editor. So this is what editor looks like. This is the tool that you'll be using to enter data. And I'm going to go to a jurisdiction. Let's go to Underhill, because we've been talking about Underhill. Oops, that's my training district. Just kidding. Here we go, Underhill. So this is what it looks like inside. This is the jurisdiction landing page for Underhill, the town of Underhill. You'll see that you've got a map, which is right here. It's already been uploaded. There's details about the jurisdiction, things like, does this jurisdiction have zoning? Is it a township or is it a municipality? That means, like, is it a village or is it a city? How many pages are in the zoning code? So Underhill, for example, has 226 pages in its zoning code. We can put links to the zoning code, links to the map. Anything that doesn't have like mandatory written in it is optional. But if it says mandatory, you have to have an answer there. And then you come down here and it takes you to the actual individual district. So let's look at the rural residential district. This is where you would be spending most of your time, is inside the district pages. This shows you, okay, these are the boundaries of the rural residential district. Is the district mapped? Yes or no? Is it mapped but extinct? Yes or no? And then you get down here, okay, my single family is allowed. So what are the rules for it being allowed? Well, it's a minimum lot size of 3 acres. It's got a 30-foot minimum required front setback. It's got a 50-foot side setback. So you enter these values, and some of them are pre-populated, like, for example, is it allowed conditional, public hearing, prohibited, or overlay? Those are pre-populated for you. Some things you can enter. So you can enter in the number of, the minimum lot size could be 3, or it could be 30, or it could be 0.4. It could be anything. That's a number. I'm gonna put it back to 3. And then there's this units over here that will tell you 33 acres is the minimum size, minimum lot size. But sometimes you're going to have contextual or alternative choices. So you could select this and say, okay, it is a contextual minimum lot size. So 3 if, Ariana, I'm on the phone, sorry, my kid. 3 if on Route 89, 2 elsewhere. I'm sorry, I'm going to tell my children to be very quiet. Hold on one second. Okay, sorry about that. So you can include contextual or alternative rules, but generally speaking, most of what you're going to enter is just like a straightforward number. And you want to be sure that it meets the requirements of the data type. So if the minimum lot size, you're not going to write the word 3, obviously, you're going to write the number 3 because it's a numeric data field. Sorry, I have 2 teenagers. And then let's see what else. Down here, you've got more data that you're collecting. These are 5 family treatments. This is where the Vermont section begins. So all of these up here, you can jump up and down, navigate on this page to the different questions, and you can enter the data there. And then when you're done, you will save the changes and you'll request a review. So I would come in and review what you've done and make sure it kind of makes sense. This is one way to enter the data. There is a separate way to enter the data, which might be easy for some people. You can do bulk edits. I'm going to show you how to do that. Oh, it doesn't want to let me there. All right, it's not going to let me do this for, oh no, I see, because I went to jurisdiction bulk edit. All right, so if we wanted to, let's say, do everything, if instead, sometimes you're like, okay, looking at the use table and you say, it would be so much easier if I could just put in the front setback for all the districts instead of going into each district individually and entering that one piece of information. You can do that using the bulk edit tool. It's a little bit more like a spreadsheet in Excel. So let's go to Burlington's district, say select this jurisdiction. I'm going to select all of its districts. And what you could do here is you could say, all right, I know what the one family, I know what the, let's see, the front one family front setback for every single district. And I can just type them all down, go down the row instead of going across and filling in all the information for the rural residential district. You could instead do the one family front setback across all the districts. So depending on the complexity of your jurisdiction and like whether there's a use table or not, you might decide to use the bulk edit tool, or you might decide to enter your information district by district. Either way is totally fine. So let me see. Oops, I lost my share. One more second. And the last thing I was going to show you is that PowerPoint. So you want to be sure that you check for any trailing white space. So if you enter information into editor, sometimes you'll be like, why isn't this validating? Like, why is it telling me that the number that I put in there isn't right? There could be a space after it. You just want to make sure that you didn't accidentally copy and paste some space in there. Do a gut check for yourself. Like if you're running all of the information for a district, you might be like, huh, that's weird. They're prohibiting they're prohibiting single family development, but they're allowing 4-family development. Like, why is it that they prohibited this, smaller unit of housing? That's not very typical. So kind of as you're going through, just ask yourself, do these values make sense that I'm assigning? Is there something that maybe I'm missing or some subtlety that I'm overlooking? And so as you go along, just constantly be doing that for yourself, because you might find mistakes that way. Save everything all the time, even though it's web-based. Like, it's very easy for it to crash, or your browser to have problems, or Wi-Fi problems to get in the middle of something that you've been working on. And make sure that if you are entering any contextual data, like I showed you, like different values for the same district, depending on where you live in the district or what type of building materials you're using or whatever, you're going to want to change the units to contextual before you enter the data, before you enter the actual value. So that way it doesn't delete that when you go change it to contextual. This will all make much more sense when you're actually doing this stuff yourself. I think the best way to learn this process is to do it, and then you'll kind of like get the hang of it. But that being said, are there any questions? Does anyone have any questions for me so far on the zoning analyst side?
No, I just add a couple of small things, Yoshi.
Oh, please do.
So as you saw, some of it can get pretty complex, like Burlington or South Burlington. Probably the first town that you do, you'll want to check and do a smaller, simpler town. That's what we started out doing. And it just made it easier for us to sort of go through a town. And because the first one you do, it's going to take you a long time, and you're going to be, there's going to be some questions too, and some ambiguity. And so, yeah, I'd pick a smaller town to begin with, and see. Yeah, and then, there's lots of things like in Vermont, sometimes, like you mentioned, the conditional use, and permitted/conditional. Vermont seems to be a little bit different than some other places. A lot of times there'll be, permitted uses, but then something will kick off a conditional, and then that means that it actually is a public hearing, even though there's not really a category. There's a public hearing category, but it's not the same as a permitted conditional. So the national one doesn't really, and sometimes doesn't fit perfectly with the way it works in Vermont. So there'll be some ambiguities, but I'm sure we can help clear it up.
Yes, there's also a notes field where you can put stuff in there too. So I forgot to mention that. If sometimes we'll have something that's just a little quirky in one district, and you'll be like, I can't, it doesn't fit the National Zoning Atlas methodology. So I need to put a note somewhere so that a user would have to kind of be on notice of this weird quirk in Vermont. So you can there's a notes field where you can enter a very brief sort of description of whatever the quirk is. And then when somebody goes to that district, that shows up in the notes too. Or it can, like, the tooltip will like show it when you sort of mouse over that area.
And then, yeah, I did just like I think Yoshi did. I'd go to that table first. Most towns have a table that has the dimensional standards, and that's a great place to start because you can fill in a lot from there. And then the rest of the stuff you just start doing Control F, and finding, keywords and stuff. The biggest problem we ran into is in two towns, the towns that actually scanned their zoning so that it was just a picture, so you couldn't actually search because it wasn't a that was the worst, but most of them are tech, they have character recognition, so it'll recognize a word, but yeah.
Agreed on getting a very simple jurisdiction to start with. We're starting in Bennington next, so there are quite a few smaller towns that we can use. I know like the town of Old Bennington has only one district, which is amazing. I would love everyone to have only one district, but since that's not possible, it's a good starter district. If you want to read something and kind of check out your understanding and ask questions before you move on to something that has like 4 or 5 districts and an overlay, like you can start with something like Old Bennington. Wow, I think we were like an hour early for finishing, which has got to be some kind of record. But I just want to say, like, this is a lot of information, and if you feel like, wow, this is overwhelming, I think that the easiest way to really get your bearings is to get in there and do some of this coding, and then you'll realize pretty quickly that all of this is actually really straightforward. And it's kind of satisfying, especially if you're sort of an OCD type like me. You're like, oh, I love to figure out, like, I like to follow the trail of like, what's the regulation to this regulation to this regulation. Or if you like the GIS part, you just feel really satisfied when you snap those boundaries together. You're like, yes, I got rid of that gap. I feel good about myself. So it can be really fun. Plus, if you have a team of people you're working with, like it's just sort of fun for you to share together the burdens and the joys of playing with new technology and finding and discovering new exciting ways to solve problems. So once you get into it, you're going to find that like this will all make much more sense when you're doing it and reading it. It's hard to watch somebody else use GIS in front of you.
Can I just ask maybe for you to speak a little bit about like where the project is at, or is there like a way of kind of quantifying that? Or
yeah, sure. We've finished all the districts in Chittenden County, and I think we're almost all in Addison. Actually, I should say in both Chittenden and Addison, we have one jurisdiction each that I think needs to be completed. So I've got South Burlington has all the dimensional standards in it. I need to finish the due process requirements, but that'll be good. And then I think, Bill, I forget what was the one you said maybe needed to be fixed. There was someone that you didn't finish.
I have to look at it, but definitely Bristol and perhaps part of Middlebury that needs to be done. But for the most part, Chittenden and Addison counties are completed. And Yoshi, you have you're the guru that has access to seeing them up online, but I don't know how we do that.
Oh,
but
let me show you. Let me show you. Oh, I'm so excited you asked.
That's but while you're doing that, can I just ask you, did you mention anything about interacting with the town zoning administrators or town planners?
Yeah, I didn't bring that up. I've generally been doing that so far. I mean, I think it's fine if people want to interact with them. It's just that I don't want anyone to get inundated with like 5 million questions from 500 different people about the same district. So it's easy if people kind of send me questions about a district or a jurisdiction. I send it to that one person.
Yeah. So when we were doing Addison County, we were contacting a lot of times the town zoning administrators, and they were super helpful. But we made at first a couple mistakes, and that was that we would send them the sort of the spreadsheet, and it's really long and onerous, and they can't figure it out. So it's better if you do contact the zoning administrator to have a very specific question for them. And then they'll usually answer it. But you also have to remember in some of these smaller counties that the administrator might be working on more than one town. Like sometimes towns pool the resources and they hire one person. So they're like a they're like part-time or a third time for one town, a third for another, and a third for another. So you'll end up with the same zoning administrator for several towns sometimes.
Yes, that's true. And I will say they've been really good about telling me when they're overwhelmed or they're like part-time or whatever. They'll just be like, I can't do that. But I think one thing I should show you, Bill, which is helpful if people want to do, if they want to do a quality review, like the zoning administrators, and like you said, they don't want to read a table, there's a little bit easier way. I'm going to show you now. So this is inside of Editor, everybody. This is, you go up to maps, you're going to go to the Atlas map, and this will show you the map as it exists right now. So this includes everybody, Vermont and every other state. And you can see where people have uploaded data. So in Vermont, we've uploaded it mostly in Addison and Chittenden. So you can filter it for the state of Vermont. You can then, let me move this up a little. Then you can see, okay, this is what the zoning atlas will look like for the state of Vermont if it were published right now. So you can tell by the color what the use is of the district is primarily residential, mixed with residential or non-residential. And then you could select a district. So let's select Underhill because we've been talking about that. And you can, it gives you a little bit of a snapshot here, but you can show the zoning district details. And here you have a little bit more readable version, Bill, of that spreadsheet. So if somebody wanted to review the data, this is a little bit more readable, I find, than that spreadsheet. So you could select, like, here's, okay, maybe not that. Let's select somebody that is maybe meaningful and helpful. Let's try 4-family. Let's try this. So here you go. This is like a full analysis of Moncton and Addison County, Vermont. And it has all of the data that we've collected, but it's not in that weird format. It's not like an Excel spreadsheet. It's not like the bulk edit tool. It's not like the district by district data entry. It's all a little bit more easy to see. So what I did with a couple people is I just took a screenshot of this and sent it to them. And it was easier for them to review than the other stuff. But for anyone who wants to, you can go into this once you have editor access and you can zoom in on a jurisdiction and take a look at what's happening at that jurisdictional level. So here's Heinsberg. I managed to pick like the most unexciting district ever. Let's see if I can pick one that's even more fun. Select this district. So you can see what's happening. This is how it displays in the National Zoning Atlas. You can see wherever your mouse is, it's giving you the snapshot of information for there. Here you've got an overlay. So you've got the Village Center District, which has everything is allowed. And then there's the Groundwater Protection Overlay District, which may have a different set of rules, but they give you what those rules might be in the display there. So this gives you a sense of what you can get. But if you wanted to get full information about the Woodland District, you can get the district details that way. We can also filter. Let's take a look at the entire state of Vermont. And you want to additional filter, you can filter it for things like where in Vermont is it? Let's take a look. Primarily residential. So that will remove any areas that are non-residential or mixed with residential, and this will give you a sense of what percentage of the surface area in the Vermont jurisdictions that we've reviewed are they designated as primarily residential. Or you can look at things like where is single family prohibited? These are the only places where single family treatments are prohibited by law or by zoning regulation. Or you might want to say, what is the minimum parking requirement? Yes or no? So we want to know, these are the places that don't have a minimum parking requirement. So you don't have to have parking with your 1 or 2 or 3, 4 family home that you're building. These are the places that do have a minimum parking requirement. You could say, where is there a minimum lot size of 2,000 square feet to 1 acre? There we go. So you can get more information out of this. This is what the final version of the zoning atlas may look like. They're still kind of playing with it in the background before they officially launch later this fall. But this is kind of, it's the same kind of thing as what you saw with Connecticut. It'll still have that interactive component where you can get that information. We'd also like to do our own analysis. So I know Bill Hegman over at Middlebury has some people who are going to be working on actual analytics of the data that we've collected so far. We might also want to do that. But for now, my primary focus for this team is to get the data up there so that we can do the analytics for the rest of the state as they become populated with this data. So to answer your question in a very long way, Dakota, we are about two counties in, and we're moving on to Bennington and Rutland next for the fall. Anybody else?
I had a question. I think you might have mentioned this earlier, but I kind of left for the GIS portion. How do we get access to the editor tool page?
Super good question. You would just, I'm going to send a link to the Slack, and you just, you can either go to edit.zoningatlas.org and sign up, or you can click it when I make that link in Slack, and then you just add yourself to the editor space and let me know when you've done that so that I can add you to the team.
Okay, awesome.
No problem. Excellent questions. Also, then you can play around and look at the map, which is really fun. And if we don't have any other questions, I think we should call it a wrap so everybody can go and have a nice rest of your day. It's really nice out here. I'd like to go for a walk. I don't know about anyone else. But thank you for coming. Thank you for caring about zoning. You all are the best. You're my favorite people. We're going to have so much fun. It's going to be way more fun than it sounds when you're looking at a lot of zoning text. I promise. All right. It's cool to meet you all. I'll see you in Slack. And I'll be on campus sometime soon. So if you're around, I'll be around tomorrow. I'll be at an event that I'm working at. But every once in a while I pop up on campus, and we should all get together and go to Winooski and have some have drinks over at the arcade. I like that. That's my thing. So I'll see you all later.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much.